Getting the various sequencers in the modular to synchronize with the DAW, including its subdivisions. It's actually pretty easy. What you need to do is basically three things. Look at the module, understand it, see how to set DP, which is easy, then remember to unset it, and then patch. So we'll do those three things. First of all, the module itself. This is what it is. It receives MIDI clock and it outputs pulses. This is a fixed 16th note pulse. You feed that in, and whatever your tempo is going at in the DAW, that's going to be putting out 16th notes. It will follow any tempo map you put in. This is an output that has a clock divider. So if you put it straight up at 116, it's the same timing as this, but you can turn this to slower or faster, including various, triplet values and rhythmic subdivisions. You can turn this while it's playing. It can be difficult to get things and keep things perfectly in sync, but sometimes that in itself is really cool and can create neat stuff. But particularly, most of the time, if I'm going to use that, I tend to set it at a different setting and then hit start, and then everything stays synchronized. Every time you hit stop on your space bar, the stop output will put out a 5-volt trigger, and you can use that to trigger the stage inputs of stage 9 on the 960 sequencers. In other words, every time you hit stop on DP, the 960s go to stage 9, so that when you hit the space bar again, they start on stage 1. And in a similar way, if you take the start output and it sends out a 5-volt pulse when you start. Don't try using that to set the 960s. It won't work. You can try and you see what happens. You can plug that into the reset input of the Moon 563 trigger sequencer, the 4-row trigger sequencer. Then you can clock that whole trigger sequencer with the single shift input, but each row is independently clockable as well. So I'll do another one in a little while that shows you how to do that. As far as DP goes, it's a piece of cake. You go to the preferences, and once you do anything in the preferences, the next time you open it, it will come back to that. First time you open it, it will come up to document, go all the way down to the very bottom, and then click one up, transmit, sync. Don't send time code, won't do anything. Beat clocks, it's the first item, 828. That is going to cause MIDI clock to go out the MIDI output, not of the MIDI interface, but of the 828 audio interface. It has a MIDI in and a MIDI out. This is important. You have to hit done and close the window. And if you don't, it'll just go crazy on you. It's okay. If you have the window open and hit play, it'll just speed up more and more and more continuously until it's just going wacko. At this juncture, if you have patched things correctly, what will happen is this. And when I hit stop, it goes right to stage 9. And that is going to track the keyboard. So let me show you some patching. You can get pretty complex with this, but the basics are actually really simple. Here's that MIDI-to-Clock interface I told you about. Let's take the variable clock output and bring it into the shift input of the sequencer. Understand that when you're doing this, you are not using the internal oscillators of the 960s at all. You never hit play on either of these. You're clocking them externally only. So in other words, if you want to use the oscillator output of the sequencer to send gates, it won't work because the oscillator should not be running. You can get gates from plenty of other places. Right now, with that one cable, if you configured DP correctly and hit play, it would start the sequencer. But then every time you hit stop, it would stop randomly on who knows what stage 6 for instance, and then the next time you hit play, it would start on stage 7. So what you can do is take the stop output and plug it into the stage 9 input. That's the patch that I have up behind me right now. So if we go to DP, again, it's going to play. And every time I hit stop, it goes to stage 9. Now, because I'm in the variable clock output mode, watch this. I'll take, for example, the fixed 16th note into the shift input of the second 960. I also need to feed the stop output into stage 9, so I'll mult it and feed it into both stage 9 inputs. So now I can set this sequencer to be playing faster or slower than this one, like this. This is with one sequencer going at the normal 16th speed and the other one going half speed. And then when you hit stop, they both go to stage 9. You can run them in different rates entirely. Now, lastly, check this out. I mentioned earlier that you can't get gates from the oscillator outputs of the sequencers because you're not using their internal oscillators. Well, I got something way better for you. This trigger sequencer, triggers and gates, 4 separate rows, 8 stages each. Each stage you can set to fire or not. There's a shift input for each stage and they're normaled. So if you feed any trigger source into shift 1, it will shift all 4 rows. If you then plug in, say, 16th note shifts into 1 and 8th note shifts into 2, 1 would be at 16th notes and then 2, 3, and 4 would be at 8th because it normally goes downstream. So what I just did behind me is I took the variable clock output, which was plugged directly into this 960, and I multed it. And then I restored the patch like that, so now it's coming through the mult. Then I took this and fed it into the shift 1 input. So now it will clock both voltage sequencers and the trigger sequencer, but the trigger sequencer isn't resetting yet, so it won't be starting consistently. This is when you take the start output of this MIDI-to-Clock and you plug it down here into the reset input. It's not identified on the panel as anything, but it's next to the reset button. So now every time you hit play, it will force this back to stage 1 at the same time these are. And I use the variable clock output to run the trigger sequencer. You could do whatever you want. So now when I hit start on the DAW, this will start at 16th notes, and this and the trigger sequencer will start at whatever subdivision I have, which at the moment is 8th notes going half as fast. And it looks like this. And then when you hit stop, the trigger sequencer will stay wherever it's at, and when you hit start, it'll force it back to stage 1. That's how that works. You can get a lot of mileage out of those 2 voltage sequencers and that 4-row trigger sequencer. So there you go. That's how you use the Moon 553 MIDI-to-Clock module.